All right. Well, thank you very much for coming to join us today to listen to Susan Meissner speak on her book, As Bright as Heaven, as well as talk about the Spanish flu and how it affected America when we went through it. Um, we are grateful to have Susan with us. She is here today virtually, but she will be back again in February. She has a new book coming out February 2nd called The Nature of Fragile Things that revolves around, I believe, the San Francisco earthquake. And she will be coming to do a luncheon with us in person to discuss that. We are still working out all the final details, but that will be on February 18th, and we are very much looking forward to it. Susan Meissner is a USA Today best-selling novelist with more than 500,000 books in print in 15 languages. Her critically acclaimed works of historical fiction have been named to numerous reading lists, including Publishers Weekly's annual roster of 100 best books, Library Read's top picks, Real Simple annual tally of best books, Goodreads Reader's Choice Awards, Booklist's top 10, and Book of the Month. She attended Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego and is a former managing editor of a weekly newspaper. Susan's expertise as a storyteller and her thoroughly researched topics make her a favorite author of book clubs everywhere. Her engaging and warm speaking style appeal to all manner of women's groups, literary organizations, libraries, and learning institutions and service clubs. So with that said, I will turn it over to Susan and I will let her take it away. Thank you so much for being here, Susan.
It's truly my pleasure to be with you all today. And we're going to be talking about As Bright as Heaven, which is a book I wrote a couple of years ago and which came out in 2018, which happened to be the centennial year of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And I love historical fiction. It's my favorite thing to read. It's my favorite thing to write. And I'm always on the lookout for a great story about something that happened in the past, but is still relevant to today. And when I was going to be writing the book that would come out in 2018, this was like 2016, I was thinking to myself, well, what will people be interested in reading in 2018? And I just had kind of a list of things to do a dive to see, does this have any story value? And one of my ideas was, well, I know that there was this pandemic in 1918 and 2018 would be the 100th anniversary, but was there a story there? I didn't know anything about it. And I didn't really meet a whole lot of other people that knew much about it either. It was like a forgotten pandemic. And so I started to research to see, is there a story here? Will people be even interested in a book that goes back in time to that time? And I was just staggered by how impactful this pandemic was. The fact that it had been forgotten surprised me because of how bad it was. The only flu or pandemic that I knew much about was the Black Death, of course, of medieval times. I mean, that pandemic I knew about. I knew a third of Europe is believed to have died. The numbers are astronomical. And I didn't think anything held a candle to that. And I was so surprised when I read that the Spanish flu pandemic is second only to that pandemic. There's no other disease in our history that comes close to those numbers that the Spanish flu had. The Black Death is the only one that's more. 50 million people are believed to have died from Spanish flu, and 650,000 Americans died of Spanish flu. It affected people no matter how old you were, if you were healthy, infirm, young, old, it didn't care. And more soldiers died in World War I of Spanish flu than in the trenches of warfare. That to me meant, my goodness, 50 million people. There has to be a story there. That's 50 million souls. And I thought they deserve to be remembered in some way. And so I set out to write then a novel that used the Spanish flu of 1918 as a backdrop. But where should I set the story? And I decided on Philadelphia because it was one of the harder hit American cities. I could have chosen a number of different places to set the story, but I chose Philadelphia. And it's a family where the dad is an undertaker. And I also chose that very carefully too, because the story is narrated by a mother. and her 3 daughters. The daughters are young, they're 15, 13, and 10. And so their perspective on what is happening, of course, is influenced by their age and their personalities. And only a witness to what was happening could really accurately tell you the story. And of course, they're watching their father and their uncle, who was also an undertaker. They're watching these 2 people handle all of this. So Philadelphia then is the backdrop. The family's a family of undertakers. And what I'm going to do for you next is I'm going to share my screen with you. I have some pictures I want to share with you to get us going here on our journey back into the past. And before we talk about the book itself, I really just wanted to give you an idea of what the world was like in 1918. In 1918, you could get a fully equipped bathroom, toilets, indoor toilets were kind of a new, wonderful thing. And the Model T was all the rage in 1918. Fashion was changing in 1918. If you can see there, those women's ankles are visible. This was the year that women could show their ankles for the first time. Hemlines were raising. In 1918, the Boston Red Sox won the World Series. And in 1918, the world was at war. Now, America had stayed out of it for the first 2.5 years, but by 1918, we had been in it with our allies across the ocean for about a year. And the Spanish flu pandemic itself really it's a moniker that's misplaced. It didn't start in Spain. Actually, it probably started here in the US. There's no real way to know patient 0. All we know is where the first recorded patient is, but it likely came from other sources elsewhere. And also the name influenza is the name for flu is an Italian word, and it means influence. And this particular virus that's been around for centuries got its name influenza in the 1700s when there was a particularly bad version of this virus. And they used to call it the grip or some other types of names. But it was so bad that medical people trying to treat it didn't know what they were dealing with. And they thought this is an otherworldly disease. And maybe it's influenced by the stars. And so influenza became its new name. And we've been dealing with influenza for centuries. But in March of 1918, what we now think is patient 0 for here was a soldier in Fort Riley, Kansas. And he was being trained to go to Europe to fight. And he came into sick bay. He was not feeling well. It was in the morning and they admitted him. And then a couple of minutes later, here comes another one. Several minutes later, here comes another one. By lunch, there were 30 or 40 men. And by the end of the week, there were 450 sick soldiers at this camp in Kansas, all young men being trained to go to war. 45 of them would die. And the virus seemed to lift, but what we didn't know was these men were then carrying the disease with them when they boarded ships to be sent over to Europe to fight. And 1.5 million American soldiers left in the spring of 1918. And wherever you had people moving about, the virus could easily then travel. And so it's believed that that's how it was able to reach pandemic proportions, is because it was a world at war and there was troop movement. And anytime troops would move around, they would spread the virus and then to civilians who would then spread it to other places. So it reached as far as Japan in the spring of 1918. In France, these are all American servicemen sick with this, what would be called then the Spanish flu. This is in San Francisco, a hangar at a naval base treating the many victims of the flu. This is Seattle. These are policemen gearing up for a day's work. Everyone was wearing masks. It looks a little bit like today, right? And this is St. Louis. These are Red Cross nurses and also wearing masks like we see today. And this is Walter Reed Medical Center, which is an Army hospital over on the east there, closer to where you are than me. And you can see all the different patients out here on the veranda. They are out there because, yes, by the time it came back to the United States, it's now the summer. of 1918. And yes, it was hot, but that's not why they're all outside. They're outside because there are no more beds inside the hospital. The beds are full of people, men, coming home from the war with what was now being called Spanish flu. It ravaged Europe all of the summer of 1918. And then it came back home to the US. Now, the reason I chose Philadelphia then was because it was a hard-hit American city. It actually began for them, their odyssey with Spanish flu began with this parade. It was the end of September 1918. There was a Liberty Loan parade planned for the end of September. It was a big event, a very patriotic event. It was seen as very unpatriotic not to go to the Liberty Loan parades happening in your city. It was meant to fund and end the war. So people were asked to, come to the parade and empty your checkbooks and your piggy banks. We need to end this war. And so they were selling Liberty Loans. And in Philadelphia, the planners of the parade, they knew that that terrible flu that was ravaging Europe was now popping up on the East Coast in different places like the Boston Naval shipyards, Army bases on the East Coast, and there were even some cases at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. But they decided to have the parade anyway because it was a civilian street. Everybody was outside. It wasn't a military installation. They figured they would be okay, and they had the parade anyway. So you can see the people standing shoulder to shoulder on these streets of downtown Philadelphia. They are, they're close to each other. They're talking to each other. They're coughing on each other. And after just 3 days, 100 people were dead in Philadelphia. And then the number would grow exponentially every day thereafter. So that by the end of the week, 800 people were dead in Philadelphia. And it just continued to mushroom those numbers. So that, by 10 days, all the schools were closed, all the churches were closed, just like what we saw here in April here in America. And as the death count grew, they ran out of coffins, they ran out of places to put people. The morgues were full. There were no more beds in any of the hospitals, and they ran out of caskets. They ran out of places for even like to store a body until it could be quickly buried. And it was pretty cataclysmic for Philadelphia. This was a sign that was put up in the Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia. And there was actually even a fine in downtown Philadelphia that if you were caught spitting, you could be fined. I think it was like $5 because they knew enough to know that the virus itself was passed through close human contact and in your mouth and then breathing on someone. There weren't mass graves everywhere. This happens to be a mass grave in Philadelphia. A lot of people could be properly buried if you had the funds to do so. But many of the people that died were poor, indigent, young immigrant families that didn't have a lot of money. And so this is a mass grave in Philadelphia that they had to use because there were too many people, too many bodies, and of course the idea was we need to get the people buried as soon as possible. This is just a little chart here that shows you, like if you look at the very top number, that 1918, it shows you by age group, how virulent this disease was by age group compared to like the 1968. I think what we would call the Hong Kong flu perhaps was 1968. But in 1918, you can see that, children younger than 1 year old, just the numbers as far as mortality. The Spanish flu had a mortality rate of 1 in 5. When it was at its worst, the mortality rate was 1 in 5, which meant if 5 people got the Spanish flu, one of them would be dead. And it didn't matter how old you were. You can look at those numbers to see how widespread the disease was. It didn't really matter how old you were compared to other years where you see the mortality rate being higher for older individuals and then extremely young ones. The interesting thing is about all of this, all of the many deaths that occurred from Spanish flu in the fall of 1918 is that by Christmas, it had pretty much lifted. And we do know that viruses like influenza is a changing virus. It changes every year, which is why you get a flu shot every year, because the flu that we had last year is not the flu we're going to have this year. And so every year, if you get a flu shot, it's going to be different than the one you got last year, because the flu virus, the influenza virus, is always changing the way it looks. And so by Christmas, it had mutated. It was a less deadly form. Many people had been exposed to it and now had antibodies to fight it. So it just lifted, as flu tends to do. It's a seasonal thing. And by the turn of the century then, and by the turn of the year, 1919, it was pretty much gone. And people went back to their ordinary lives. People went back to dance class. And this is a street in Los Angeles. People went back to commerce. People, they got married again. And so out of that backdrop then is the book I wrote, As Bright as Heaven. It's also in paperback, looking like this. And it is about a family where the dad is an undertaker. The mom also tells the story. Her three daughters tell the story. They in alternating chapters. The daughters are Evie, Maggie, and Willa. They're different from each other. They're experiencing the same experience, but differently because of their ages. And of course, they are, telling the reader, the story based on what they see. And they're seeing a lot because of who their dad is. I didn't want the book to be a downer, though. I knew that Spanish flu, I couldn't sugarcoat anything, but I did want there to be hope in the pages. And so that's why you see the butterflies. I use the motif of butterflies all throughout the story, very, very subtly. You can almost miss it if you're not looking for it. But if you haven't read the book, I'm giving you a little clue, is to look for the butterflies. Butterflies remind us of the metamorphosis of our lives, from one life to the next, from this life to, I believe in heaven. So from this life to heaven, they're beautiful. They remind us of how beautiful life can be. They're also fragile, and they don't live what we would say a very long life, but they still have a beautiful life when for the time that they're here. And so I do feel like I've threaded hope into the story, even though I could not make the Spanish flu less than what it was. It is not a book just about death. It really is a book about life. And I feel like what makes life valuable and precious is the fact that we're mortal. Our lives are finite. And so that's what gives them meaning, is the fact that we only have the one life, and it's a finite life. And so we look to make it the most beautiful we can. And the way you do that, of course, is surrounding yourself with people you love and people who love you. Now, you're probably wondering, I know I did, is why was it forgotten? Like this terrible pandemic, the Black Death is the only one that's worse. Why was it forgotten? This is one of the books I read for my research, and it's even titled that, America's Forgotten Pandemic. And there's no way to know exactly why it was forgotten. I have my theory, and that is, the war ended on November 11 of 1918, Armistice Day. The flu began to lift right around then too. And so the world was coming out of a very terrible time. It was awful in so many ways. The war, World War I, was cataclysmic. Men were coming home from the war, changed, different. Some of them were missing limbs. Some of them were forever changed inside their souls. They had seen too much, done too much. And what we would call PTSD now, they just called shell shock. There was no other name for it. And so out of that, and then of course the terrible impact of the flu. So out of that, we have the survivors, everyone who survived both of those things, emerging out of that difficult time. And I think they just decided, this is how we're going to recover from that. We're going to shut the door. And they did. They shut the door on it. They kind of turned their back on all of that sorrow and grief and loss. And they moved forward by just forgetting, because to remember was just too painful. So that is my theory. And I think that is why, all these generations later, here I am trying to research it in 2016, and it's all but forgotten. Back in 2016, I could have said to anybody, do you know much about the Spanish flu? And people would have said, no, when was that? It was in Spain. And of course, now it's different now because we are in our own pandemic, but it had almost been forgotten. And I think, which is a shame. I think it's why historical fiction can help keep memories alive, because I think it should be remembered, not just because of what you can learn from a pandemic. We certainly are learning are using the lessons of 1918 today, but also because of the people. You know, history is always about the people, not just dates and times and places. And I think when you remember people in story, you remember them. You might be interested to know that this is a picture of an Alaskan village that there were victims of the flu everywhere, like I mentioned. In fact, this particular village, there were like only 80 people living in it in 1918. And when the flu came there, it was a missionary village. When the flu came to this missionary village, and like out of the 80 people living there, like 72 were dead. It pretty much, it decimated the village. And the people that died in that missionary village were buried in a mass grave together. And many years later, a microbiologist was wanting to, he kind of made it his mission to locate the gene. Like, we need to know what that virus looks like so we can recognize it again. And he had heard that, you know, sometimes lung tissue can survive inside a victim if they're in permafrost. And he went to Alaska, got permission, and dug up 4 of the victims from this mass grave, and they were nicely preserved in the permafrost. He got lung tissue, came back to Iowa with it, but it wasn't enough. He couldn't replicate the virus, and so he gave up. But 46 years later, he hears about a man who's also trying to do that, trying to replicate the virus, the 1918 virus, and he can't do it because he doesn't have enough tissue samples. So our first man goes back to the Alaskan village and gets permission again. And this time he finds a different victim. It was a large woman whose fatty tissue around her lungs preserved her lung tissue even more than any of the victims they had used before. So he removed her lungs and sent them to this other biologist. And they were able to then replicate the Spanish flu virus from that lung tissue. So now they know exactly what it looks like. It looks like H1N1. And they were able to create a vaccine for it in 2005. So if we ever see that version of H1N1 again, we know exactly what to do. So here's a picture of it's marked, the little gravesite is marked for all of those victims in that missionary village. These are the 2 viruses. If you're interested in what they look like, these are the 2 viruses. The blue one is the one we're seeing today. That's the coronavirus, and the green one is the Spanish flu influenza virus. You can see they look different and they have different properties. And I'm no scientist. I did do a little bit of research on this, and they are different kinds of viruses. Coronaviruses are different than influenza viruses, even though they attack the upper respiratory system. The coronavirus doesn't change its clothes like the flu virus does. And you can see that little statistic there that from December to June, what we call now COVID-19, it had like less than 10 mutations, where the influenza virus changes the way it looks, you know, six times as often. So they're different. We don't know if the COVID virus that we're seeing is seasonal. We don't know yet. It appears like maybe it's not. The flu virus, it tends to have seasons. And it might be that we will have our little visitor with us during the time where we all need to be exposed to it in some way, either by vaccine or by just exposure, so that we all begin to develop the antibody that we're going to need to wage war against it. So who can say what the future holds? We do know, though, that there are many different places working on a vaccine so that we can be exposed to it in a safe way. What I like to think about with the Spanish flu pandemic is it did end, and out of it came the Roaring 20s, which was a crazy time, except that it shows us that, you know, after all of that loss and heartache, the world was ready to be happy again, and it found a way. It found a way to recover and be happy again. You know, one of the ways was just forgetting it, which we will not be able to do, nor do I think we should. But it comforts me to know that the world experienced, you know, this death, so much death and sadness, but it was able to turn around and, you know, mourn the dead, but grab hold of hope and move out of it into a season again of hope and happiness. That makes me very happy. So these are the two books then, the paperback version there on the left and the hardback version, which you can still find in some places on the right. And anyway, these are some places where you can find me. You can all, I can come back to the slide if you wish. But what I'm going to do now is just go ahead and go back out to, I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, and I'll be able to take any of the questions you might have. So if you have a question for me about anything I've shared with you, about this book or any of my other books, I can also share with you what the next book is going to be about. You can either type your message in the chat, or you can ask me in the Q&A, and I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Okay, well, while we're waiting for questions, I can tell you about the book that's coming out in February, if that's of interest. Should we do that? Should we do that?
I think so.
Okay, because I know sometimes you're thinking, well, I don't know if I have any questions. I need to think for a minute. So you go ahead and think about what you might want to ask me, and I'll tell you about the book that's coming out in February, the one that I hopefully will be able to see you in person and talk to you about. My fingers are crossed that we will be able to do that. I'm really looking forward to doing that. But the book is called The Nature of Fragile Things. And the idea behind that is that, well, we know that the nature of something fragile is if you throw it, it will break. If you drop it, it will shatter. But the idea here is that not everything that looks fragile is. Not every person who appears to be fragile actually is. And sometimes you don't know how resilient you are until you're forced to find out. And that's the title. What it's about then is I have an Irish immigrant. She's young. She's living in a terrible tenement situation in New York City. She has a troubled past, and she wants out of New York. She wants out of New York so bad that she answers a mail order bride ad for a San Francisco widower who has a 5-year-old daughter, and she becomes a mail order bride. She comes out to San Francisco on a train, gets off the Oakland ferry, goes with this man who she has just met there at the ferry, marries him at the courthouse, and tries to begin then a new life. And for a little while, she's able to convince herself that she's cobbled together a version of happiness, because she has, for the first time, almost everything she has long wanted. Her name is Sophie, and she has a nice house to live in now. She's got pretty close to where she has good food to eat. She's got this little girl who does not speak, by the way, and that's attributed to the loss of her mother. And she knows that she can't have children, so she thinks, I can love that little girl into talking again. And her new husband is not unkind. He's not mean or abusive. And so for all those reasons, she's able to think, I'm okay. This is great. I have a good life. It's a wonderful life. And she can dismiss the fact that there's something up with him. She can't quite figure it out. He's aloof. She can tell that he's not always truthful, but she just dismisses it because she's got everything else she has long wanted. And so she just dismisses the idea that there's something up with her new husband, that she can't quite trust him. And she's able to do that until just before dawn on a certain morning in April 1906, when there was a big earthquake and everything got shaken up. And I mean everything. And so when the dust settles, she's no longer able to dismiss what she had been able to dismiss the day before the earthquake. Everything's been laid bare. The city is now on fire, and she has to escape, not just the burning city, but her situation. And so it's a book about mother love because of this little girl. It's a book about female solidarity because she does not enter the quest to survive all of this alone. She will meet people, and they will become each other's confidant and knight in shining armor, if you will. So it's a book about friendship, mother love, female solidarity, and just the power of the human spirit when you are forced to make choices in an upside down world. So it comes out in February, and I can't wait to go around out and about and share. So I'm hoping we'll be able to see each other in February when that book comes out. So it looks like we have a question. Have you read it yet?
Yes, we have a couple.
You want to read it to me?
Yeah. So the very first question is from Mr. Steinberg. He was interested to know what type of literature you used for your research.
I look for everything. I end up first, like my first go-to are what I would say really well-vetted nonfiction works. And so for, in fact, I can show you the one for As Bright as Heaven. This book by John M. Barry is wonderful. It's a New York Times bestseller. And if you are interested in reading about the Spanish flu pandemic from the view of an academic who really knows how to write, this is the book. If you've read anything by Eric Larson, you know how he's able to write about historical events in creative narrative nonfiction form. And this book is that way too. I think I read it probably 5 times just so that I could feel like the data that the data that he uncovered felt like it was part of my brain, so that when I was writing the story, I had the facts. I just needed to create a fictional story to go along with what I already knew. I highly recommend that book. There were other books like his. His was the best. I was also able to become a member of the Free Library of Philadelphia. I live out of state, but it was really inexpensive to become an out-of-state member of that library system. And then I was able to avail myself of everything they have digitally, and they have a lot in digital archives. So I was able to read the front page of the Philadelphia morning newspaper every day of the pandemic. So I was able to see, well, what were they saying about this? And just like what was the community feeling? And because you get a feel for a community by reading its newspaper, not just the stories about the pandemic, but the stories about the war and other things that were happening, and like the death notices and the obituaries, all of it was all in there. So I was reading those daily newspapers to kind of get a feel for the people who were living there. I went to Philadelphia. Sometimes you can't visit the place that you're writing about because it doesn't exist anymore the way it was then. But Philadelphia, downtown Philadelphia, even though some of the buildings have changed, a lot of it hasn't. The streets are the same. And so I was able to walk the streets my characters would have walked and see some of the things that they would have seen. That's always helpful to me. And then I look for memoirs. Sometimes people will write a memoir about something they've experienced. I did not come across any memoirs from people who experienced the Spanish flu, but for other books that I have written, I've come across memoir. And they are wonderful too, because even though it may not always be completely factual, because when we experience something, we experience our truth. And sometimes it's couched in just our own loves and hates and fears and all of that. But it's always true for the person who experienced it. And I think that's great when you can talk to somebody through the pages of their book who actually lived through it. And then live interviews are always wonderful too. So those are some of the things I go to for research.
The next question is from Debbie Sear. She says, "What I love about your books is that your characters seem to try to do the right thing. They have dilemmas and face hard decisions and may stray, but always seem to mean well. Do you consciously draw your characters that way? Am I wrong in this?"
Well, I think what it is I feel like the books that have stayed with me the longest are books where characters are placed in a tough spot, like a moral dilemma, and then they had to make a choice. And the books that I remember the most, and the books that seem like they've left their imprint on me, are when the characters made a choice that was like good for humanity. Do you know what I mean? Like they decided to do something that in the end made them like someone you'd want to emulate. Because when you're faced with a moral dilemma, usually it's because you have to make a choice. And sometimes the choice is like neither one is good. And sometimes it's definitely one is better than the other. And sometimes you make the choice and it's the wrong one, and then you end up having to live with it. But in the end, if you can see how you've grown as a person after having made that decision and the effect you have on other people who are watching you, like the younger generation and all of that, I feel like those kinds of people and those kinds of characters, they're the ones that I feel like make humanity better. And I love stories that are the opposite, with the anti-hero. I do. They're fun to read. But the ones that kind of stay with me and the ones that kind of inspire me are the stories about people that somehow they went the extra mile to do something good for humanity.
And we have one more question from Debbie Sear. She says, the first two books of yours I read centered around the Second World War. Is that a particular interest of yours?
It is. And I think it's because World War II, even though there are many, many books right now set during that time period, it is still a treasure trove of stories waiting to happen, because it it was all over the world. It's hard to find a place where World War II wasn't being affected. It wasn't affecting the community of peoples everywhere. And it forced ordinary people to experience extraordinary circumstances. And you and I, we're all pretty much ordinary people. And so when we're placed into an extraordinary circumstance, it usually makes for an interesting read. And so I think World War II, because it was so pervasive, it didn't just happen to the soldiers that fought it, it happened to the civilians everywhere. That we just have, there are a lot of stories waiting to be told, because there were so many different ways and places where World War II affected the planet. And also too, I like to stick around in the first half of the 20th century. I used to write historical fiction all over the place. Like I wrote about the Italian Renaissance, and I wrote about the Salem witch trials and the Civil War, which was all really fun. But I realized when I settled into a lane that I felt like I found my groove. And I think my readers then tend to know what to expect from me, is if I kind of hang around a certain set of years, that I will be able to keep my readers with me who enjoy that kind of book, and then maybe gain new readers who also want that kind of book. So most of my books now, probably from 2014 onward, have been set in the first half of the 20th century.
Excellent. Well, those are all the questions I have, unless anyone else has a question. No. I have a quick question while we wait. You said you wrote about the Salem witch trials. Is that a published book that you have, or was that a shorter piece that you did? Or
yeah, it is published. It was published in 2008. It's called The Shape of Mercy. And it was my first historical novel. Up to that point, I had been writing contemporary fiction, which was fun, but I kind of found my spot with The Shape of Mercy. And I realized, oh, historical fiction, that's me. That's where I'm going to be. And I haven't written anything different since. I just love the genre. And what it's about is, I have a college student in Santa Barbara she's lived a privileged life. She comes from a rich family. She's going to UC Santa Barbara. She's young. She's majoring in English, even though her father wanted her to major in business. And she kind of feels like she has to prove herself to her dad. She kind of feels like he wishes he had had a son, to give the family empire to. It's not true, but she feels that this is true. And so she's on this mission to kind of prove herself. She wants to earn her own money. So she takes a job transcribing a diary of someone who witnessed the Salem witch trials. And she takes this job from this older woman who lives in Santa Barbara, who went to the college to look for an English major to do this for her. And it's her first time making her own money. And so she's transcribing this diary, because it's falling apart. It's 400 years old. She's transcribing it and putting it onto a computer so that it will not fade into nothingness. When the ink fades and the paper finally disappears, they'll still have the words of the diary. And so you're going back and forth between Lauren, the current day person, and Mercy Haworth, who's in 1696 Salem, Massachusetts. And so the two dovetailed stories are kind of speaking to each other, although these women, of course, never meet. And Lauren begins to understand more about preconceived notions, how we jump to conclusions based on crowdthink, and what happens when we operate out of fear rather than wisdom. Because everybody who was hanged in Salem during the Salem witch trials was later exonerated. None of them were witches at all, which is it's nice to be exonerated, except they were all still dead. So we learned some lessons about judging people based on fear rather than truth. But 19 people were still dead. And so I feel like that's a lesson we continually need to learn, is that number one, we shouldn't be judging people anyway. And number two, if we're going to make conclusions, come to conclusions about people, you have to base it on truth and not fear, because fear will always lead you down the wrong path. So The Shape of Mercy is kind of it's a book about the Salem witch trials, but it's also a book about, just about thinking about how we treat other people and how we place ourselves in the position of judge when we really don't really have any right to do that.
Excellent. Thank you.
Welcome.
We have one other statement from Debbie Sear. She wanted to say thank you for speaking to us. She's only found you in the last few years, but she enjoys your characters for all the reasons you've spoken of. And thank you so much for today.
Oh,
and
my pleasure.
I agree with that. We are so glad to have had you. It was a pleasure, and we're greatly looking forward to seeing you in February, assuming things continue to go well, which we hope they do.
Yes, fingers crossed.
Yes, cross fingers, wear masks, wash hands.
Yeah. And don't touch your face.
And no spitting, lest you be fined.
Right.
So it was an absolute pleasure. I think that's probably it on the questions. Let me just make sure. Yes, I scrolled all the way down. That's everything. All right. Well, again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all of our attendees who joined in as well. Please keep an eye on our newsletters and tidings for further presentations and for information as well on Susan Meissner's presentation in February. I know we did have at least one person jump in kind of late into the game. So if you missed the beginning, we will be posting this on our Palmetto Bluff YouTube account. So we will put that link out in our next issue of Tidings as well, in case you missed some, or in case you know of someone who you think may be interested in watching who couldn't make it today. So thank you again, Susan, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.
Well, thanks for having me. Hopefully we'll see you in the new year. Have a great rest of the year and a super sweet holiday season.
Thank you very much. Same to you.
All righty. Bye-bye.